There was a moment, sometime in the mid-1980s, when Michael Jackson was quite literally the most famous human being on the planet Earth. Not the most famous musician, not the most famous entertainer, the most famous person in any category, in any country, in any language, who had ever lived up to that point in recorded history. His face was on every magazine. His voice came out of every radio. His moves were being imitated in dance studios from Tokyo to Lagos to Buenos Aires. Children who had never heard a word of English knew every syllable of his songs by heart. And yet, behind the walls of his Neverland ranch, in the small hours of night, the man who had everything was reportedly unable to sleep without powerful sedatives. He was terrified of growing old. He was terrified of being ugly. He was terrified, above all else, of becoming something he'd been told he already was. Worthless, talentless, nothing, by the one man whose approval he had spent his entire life desperately, hopelessly chasing. How does the most celebrated artist in human history end up dying alone on a gurney, his body so depleted, so chemically dependent, so broken from decades of invisible suffering that the doctor standing over him didn't even realize he was already gone? What happened to the little boy from Gary, Indiana, who could sing like an angel before he could properly read? And why, despite everything, despite the accusation, the trials, the tabloid madness, the physical transformation that shocked the world, do billions of people around the globe still feel, when they hear his music, something that can only be described as grief? To understand Michael Jackson, you cannot start with the music. You have to start with the fear. Gary, Indiana in the 1950s and 1960s was a steel town. Hard, industrial, unforgiving. The kind of place where men worked themselves into early graves and called it dignity. Joseph Walter Jackson, Michael's father, was a man shaped entirely by that environment. He had dreams of his own once, a guitar, a band, ambitions that never quite caught fire. By the time his 9 children filled the small house on Jackson Street, those dreams had curdled into something else entirely. Something that would leave marks on his children that no amount of fame or money would ever fully erase. Joe Jackson was not a man who believed in gentleness. He believed in results. And from the moment he recognized that his sons Jackie, Tito, Jermaine, Marlon, and the youngest performing member, little Michael, had genuine musical talent, he drove them with a ferocity that people who witnessed it still struggled to describe without lowering their voices. Rehearsals lasted for hours. Mistakes were not tolerated. The belt was never far away. Michael, who was performing publicly by the age of 5 years old, on a stage, in front of strangers, later described a childhood in which he was simultaneously living every child's fantasy and experiencing something that no child should ever have to endure. He was adored by thousands of strangers and terrified of the man who was supposed to love him most. But that was only the beginning of the contradictions that would define his entire life. By the time Michael Jackson was 10 years old, he was already a professional. The Jackson 5 had been signed to Motown Records. Berry Gordy, one of the most powerful figures in American music, had recognized immediately that this small, doe-eyed boy with the enormous voice was something the music industry had never quite seen before, a child who performed not with childish enthusiasm, but with the emotional depth and technical precision of someone 3 times his age. The records came. The hits came. I Want You Back. ABC. I'll Be There. Songs that sounded effortless, joyful, alive, and were recorded in studios where Joe Jackson stood in the background, watching, always watching, making sure his children understood that failure was not an option. What nobody realized at the time was what all of this was costing the boy at the center of it. Michael Jackson did not have a childhood. This is not a metaphor. He did not attend school with other children. He did not play in the street. He did not experience the slow, ordinary unfolding of adolescence that most people take completely for granted. While other boys his age were making friends, falling off bicycles, staying up too late, Michael was on tour buses, in recording studios, on television stages, performing emotions for audiences that he had not yet had the life experience to actually feel. He later said, in his own words, that he would sometimes see children playing outside through the window of a car or a tour bus, and he would press his face against the glass and watch them, and feel something he couldn't name, a longing so deep it had no bottom. And then things became even worse. As Michael entered adolescence, his father began making comment about his appearance, specifically about his nose, his skin, the acne that arrived with puberty. Joe Jackson reportedly called his son Big Nose in front of other people, in front of strangers. His own father, the man whose voice Michael heard in his head whenever he looked in the mirror. For a boy who was already deeply insecure, already carrying wounds that had never been acknowledged, let alone treated, those words landed like something permanent. The world would spend decades debating what Michael Jackson did to his face. Very few people stopped to ask why. The answer, at least in part, was standing in that rehearsal room in Gary, Indiana, with a belt in his hand. By the time the 1980s arrived, Michael Jackson had already been famous for over a decade. He had already achieved more than most artists dream of in a lifetime. And yet, what he was about to do would make everything that came before it look like a warm-up act. Off the Wall in 1979 announced a new Michael. Not the child star, not the Motown product, but an artist with a vision that was entirely unmistakably his own. And then, in 1982, came Thriller. There are not adequate words in the English language to describe what Thriller did to popular culture. It did not just sell records, though it sold more records than any album in history, a title it still holds. It did not just produce hit singles, though nearly every track on it became a classic. What Thriller did was fundamentally alter the relationship between music, visual storytelling, and global popular culture in a way that had simply never been done before. The Thriller music video, 14 minutes long, cinematic in scope, featuring zombies and Vincent Price, and a transformation sequence that left audiences genuinely open-mouthed, was not a music video. It was a short film. It played in movie theaters. It was watched by people who had never owned a record player. Michael Jackson did not just make music. He invented a new language. But something else was happening during these years that the public was not fully seeing. The loneliness that had begun in Gary, Indiana, that face pressed against the car window, watching other children play, had never gone away. It had simply gotten bigger, in the way that unfilled spaces do when everything around them grows. Fame, it turned out, was the loneliest possible condition for a man who had never learned how to simply be a person. Everyone wanted something from Michael Jackson. Everyone had an agenda, a project, a need. The people who got closest to him were often the people who needed the most from him. And the people who asked nothing, the children he invited to Neverland, the kids who didn't care about record sales or tour schedules or business deals, became, in his mind, the only truly safe human beings in his world. This is a part of the story where the narrative becomes genuinely, uncomfortably complicated, because what happened next would split the world in two, and more than 30 years later, it has not fully healed. In 1993, a 13-year-old boy named Jordan Chandler and his family accused Michael Jackson of sexual abuse. The accusation detonated like a bomb in the center of Michael Jackson's career, his reputation, and his sense of self. He denied everything, completely, passionately, publicly. He gave a television interview in which he showed the world his vitiligo, the skin condition that had been slowly removing pigmentation from his body for years, in an attempt to explain the physical changes that had fueled years of tabloid speculation. He looked, in that interview, not like a guilty man performing innocence, but like a deeply wounded one performing survival. The case was settled out of court. No criminal charges were filed, but the damage to public perception was, in many ways, irreversible. The man who had been the world's greatest entertainer was now something more complicated, more contested, more difficult to simply love without reservation. What happened next shocked everyone, including, perhaps, Michael himself. He got married to Lisa Marie Presley, daughter of Elvis, in 1994. The union seemed to the outside world almost surreal. Two children of impossible fame. Two people who had been shaped by fathers whose shadows never quite lifted. Two human beings who understood, perhaps better than anyone else alive, what it meant to be simultaneously worshipped and completely alone. The marriage lasted less than 2 years. Lisa Marie would say later that she had genuinely loved him, that she had tried to reach him, that there was something in Michael Jackson that was simply heartbreakingly unreachable. Then came the second marriage to Debbie Rowe, and the children, Prince Paris and the youngest Blanket, whose real name was Prince Michael II. Michael Jackson as a father was, by almost every account from people who witnessed it, something remarkable, tender, present, devoted in a way that seemed to come from that same bottomless longing he had carried since childhood, the desperate need to give his own children everything that had been taken from him. He homeschooled them. He kept them masked in public, not out of eccentricity, but out of a terror of the world getting too close to the only people he truly trusted. But the truth was far more complicated than any public image could contain. In 2003, documentary filmmaker Martin Bashir released Living with Michael Jackson. Footage shot over months of private access that Michael had granted, believing it would finally allow the world to see him honestly. Instead, the documentary presented him in a way that felt, to many viewers, exploitative. His comments about sharing his bedroom with children meant in his mind convey innocent parental warmth, landed in the court of public opinion as something far more sinister. A second wave of accusations followed. A second criminal trial. This one went all the way. 13 counts, a California courtroom, a jury, the entire world watching. In 2005, Michael Jackson was acquitted on all counts. He walked out of that courthouse a free man, legally exonerated. But something in him had broken that would not be repaired. He left America. He moved to Bahrain, then Ireland, then Las Vegas. A man without a country, without a home, without the safety he had been searching for his entire life. By 2009, the money was gone. The Neverland ranch had been sold. The debts were staggering. And so, at 50 years old, a man whose body had been through more than any performer's body should ever be asked to endure, the surgeries, the injuries, the decades of physical demand, the chemical dependency on painkillers that had begun after stage accident burned his scalp during a Pepsi commercial shoot in 1984, agreed to perform 50 concerts at London's O2 Arena. This is it. The tour was called. He would never perform a single one. On June 25, 2009, Michael Jackson was found unresponsive in his rented Los Angeles mansion. His personal physician, Dr. Conrad Murray, had been administering propofol, a powerful surgical anesthetic, to help him sleep. Murray left the room. When he returned, Michael Jackson was not breathing. He was pronounced dead at UCLA Medical Center at 2:26 in the afternoon. He was 50 years old. The news traveled around the world in minutes. It crashed websites. It stopped conversations in offices, in schools, in markets and countries where people had grown up hearing his voice without ever owning a television. People wept in Times Square. They wept outside the Apollo Theater in Harlem, where he had first performed as a child. They wept in Seoul, in Cairo, in Sao Paulo, in places where his music had arrived long before his name did. Conrad Murray was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter and served 2 years in prison. But the grief the world felt in those days after his death was not simply grief for a musician. It was something older and harder to name. It was grief for a childhood that was stolen before it began. It was grief for a man who had given the world joy he himself was rarely permitted to feel. It was grief for the distance between the image and reality, the moonwalking silhouette, frozen mid-step against a spotlight, an exhausted, frightened, deeply human person standing inside it. What does the life of Michael Jackson ultimately reveal? It reveals that talent alone is not protection. It reveals that the most visible people can be the most invisible, that a man watched by billions can still die feeling utterly unseen. It reveals something uncomfortable about the world that created him, a world that consumed his gifts without ever truly asking what producing those gifts was costing him, a world that loved the performance and was deeply, sometimes viciously, uncomfortable with the performer. Michael Jackson was not a simple man. His life does not resolve into a clean moral. The accusations against him remain, for many people, a wound that is not closed and perhaps never will. But what is undeniable is this. He arrived in this world as a small boy in Gary, Indiana, with a voice that seemed to come from somewhere beyond ordinary human experience. He spent his entire life trying to find a place where he could simply exist without being consumed. He never quite found it. The moonwalk was not just a dance step. It was the perfect metaphor for his entire life. Moving forward while appearing to slide backward, going somewhere while seeming to stay still, defying gravity for just long enough to make the audience believe that maybe this time he wouldn't have to come back down. He always came back down. In the end, we all do. But for those few seconds, suspended between earth and air, between the boy from Gary and the legend the world made of him, for those few impossible seconds, there was nothing else like it in the world, and there never will be again.